It almost sounds like a conspiracy. With the Democratic president getting ready to run for re-election, Republicans in states across the country have been introducing and passing laws that make it harder for groups of voters who traditionally help Democrats win elections to vote. 7 states so far this year have enacted new laws that require voters to show photo ID at the polls. Ohio and Pennsylvania are now considering similar legislation. Ohio is also among the states that have introduced restrictions on voting registration drives, like voting registration at the supermarket. And do you like early voting? At least 5 states, including Florida and Ohio, have enacted bills to reduce early voting periods. 4 more states have bills just like them in the works. In all, Republicans in about half the states are trying to make it harder to vote or to register to vote. Doesn't this sound like a conspiracy theory? I mean, kind of a mustache twisting. If there were a conspiracy, isn't this exactly what one would look like? To make the appearance of conspiracy even sharper, one state seems to be planning to make it harder for voters to meet the new, stricter requirements. It's happening in Wisconsin, where earlier this year, Governor Scott Walker signed that state's voter ID bill into law. If Stage 1 was weakening the unions by limiting their collective bargaining rights, Stage 2 was disenfranchising Democratic voters. So what's Stage 3? Apparently, Stage 3 involves closing DMV offices, the places you go to get voter IDs. The Associated Press reports that the Walker administration is finalizing a plan to close as many as 10 DMV offices. And one Democratic lawmaker says the offices targeted for closure are all in Democratic areas, and that hours will be expanded in Republican parts of the state. Now, the Walker administration denies the charges, saying that more people in all counties will be served when the final plan is put into effect. But what about the poor? The people who work 2 shifts in order to make ends meet. Folks who can't afford a car, let alone the time to stand in line between the hours of 9 and 5. Or the disabled. How and where are they going to meet the requirements of the new voter ID bill? Or young voters who haven't gotten their first driver's license yet. Those most likely to vote Democratic are also those most likely to be hurt by the new set of voting rules Americans will face when they go to the polls next year. That's assuming, of course, that they make it there at all. Joining us now is Mordecai Lee, professor of government affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Professor Lee is also a former member of the Wisconsin State Assembly and the Wisconsin State Senate. From a New Orleans Saint to a Wisconsin Packer, let me just say that thank goodness the NFL is better at reaching compromise than the U.S. Congress. But on to this more serious issue. It's really nice to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
How do you think that this plan to shut down several DMVs will affect the elderly woman who needs to get a voter ID or the young man who lives in a rural part of the state? What does it look like on the ground for them?
Well, we in Wisconsin used to think that we were the good government state, the clean government state. But it turns out that partisan politics here is like what's happening everywhere else in the country. It's a contact sport. And if the majority party can change the rules of the game to benefit the majority party, they do it. And I think that's exactly what's happening with the voter ID law. That how does somebody who doesn't have a driver's license go to the DMV to get a free ID card that has their photo on it? The logic of it seems to me, is pretty compelling.
Well, speaking of logic, the Brennan Center for Justice found that only 44 1/millionth of 1%, let me say that again, 44 1/millionth of 1% of votes are cast by people who have committed voter fraud. So when these laws go into effect, claiming that they're going to be shutting down the voter fraud problem in part by shutting down DMVs, does somehow shutting down the DMVs give the Republicans a more defensible way to disenfranchise voters? After all of us hate the DMV. I mean, is that what's happening here?
I think this was a pretty smooth move. What the legislature wanted to do and said was that there had to be one DMV office open 20 hours a week in every county. Now, that does sound like good government, and they gave DMV another couple $1 million for the free ID cards. The problem is that when you do it on a county-by-county basis, that means that you're tending to tilt towards rural counties, low population counties. And so the example you mentioned in your introduction is about Jefferson County, which is halfway between Milwaukee and Madison. Right now there are 2 DMV offices, and based on the statutory request of just one in every county, they'll probably close one of them. That makes it harder for people to get to DMV to get the card in the first place.
So, look, I liked what you said about Wisconsin being the place where government works, because it's been fascinating to watch the people of Wisconsin pushing back against so much of what has happened since the 2010 midterms. In fact, when we gave Wisconsinites the opportunity to vote, we saw Wisconsinites reelecting Democrat Dave Hansen by a landslide. Look, do Republicans even stand a chance in Wisconsin unless they make these kinds of draconian voter ID laws?
Well, it seems to me that the whole concept of public service, of serving the public, has moved really to the right as part of the national conversation. After all, if 5 years ago or 10 years ago we had been talking about DMV offices being open only 20 hours a week, or state parks or airports or something like that, I, as a professor of public administration, I think we've lost the concept of serving the public, that every public office ought to be open 40 hours a week, and there ought to be adequate funding for it. And so the recalls that you're mentioning that are coming up 2 Tuesdays from now and 3 Tuesdays from now, that's really a referendum if people like what's going on or don't like what's going on. And the conventional wisdom right now is that the tide of public opinion is going for Democrats. But you have to say that Republican incumbents have an advantage in every election, just like all other incumbents.
Well, so, you know, this show has talked a lot about exactly that question of the public good. What makes sense for the public? And I guess I'm interested here. Since when did we think that making it harder to vote was a democratic, with a little d, value, right? I mean, under what circumstances do we think that disenfranchisement, or at least making it much harder to meet the rules of having the ability to vote, is a good way to move forward with a democracy?
Well, I think this really links to your previous segment when we were talking about the civil rights era. After all, giving African Americans the right to vote was considered a good thing, a nonpartisan thing. But really, ever since then, every argument about enfranchisement or disenfranchisement has really been about partisan advantage. And I don't necessarily think that the Democrats have just purely clean hands. Every party wants to gain an advantage. Democrats want lower income and younger people to be able to vote. And that's sort of what the fight in Wisconsin is all about.
Professor Lee, thank you so much for your time this evening. That was Mordecai Lee, Professor of Government Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Coming up, the best new thing in the world today. If you have a dog, you should go get him or her and bring her to the TV. This is a moment to share.